why can two families be on exactly the same size farm, similar sort of situation? One thrives across his generation and the other one doesn't. And it all came back to, well, there's a few things they need to do to be able to do that sets them apart. And the key factor that I've identified, and I've checked the research out and anecdotally myself from watching a lot of families, was that the families that succeed see the strength of the financial position of the family. So the financial strength in the family, the fact that we've got this financial knowledge and acumen and we're building financial strength. And I'm not talking about they have to be billionaires, but they're building a strong, solid financial base. They value that just as much as strong family relationships. Choose your own ideal future. Don't let someone else make that for you. Because what's going to happen is if you don't plan out the future and articulate and have a vision for your future, it's not going to happen. So those kids that aren't involved in the farm, we need to be involving them from an early age and talking about these issues. If you want to be back in the farm and you want to be involved, what have you got to do? Like what I call the when-thens. If you want responsibility or you want ownership, this is what needs to happen. When this happens, then that will happen.
Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine Froese, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hey there, folks. Welcome again to an episode number 40 already of the Farm Family Harmony podcast. And I'd like to give a shout out to my running friend in BC as you're listening to this while you're running through the woods of BC, and also to the farmer who reached out to me recently who said, hey, my mom gave me your podcast. I listened to it and I'm talking more now. So that's in our farm family coaching world called progress. And I'm really excited today because my guest is from down under, as you would call it. When I grew up as a young farm girl close to Winnipeg, we had trainees on our farm, and a couple of them were from Australia. And I've always had a fondness for Australia because I've been to Australia, to South Australia, to speak back in 2012 in the Clare Valley. So a shout out to any friends from that part of Australia. And our guest today is Ben Law. And Ben, you have had a couple of different labels. One of them is the financial bloke, and the other one is agri-coach. So can you just tell us a little bit about your story? I also know you're a farm kid, so you started off in the same place I did.
Well, thanks for having me here, Elaine. It's a very weird thing to be sitting on the other side of the table. It's a little, you've got to slow things down and listen a lot more, which is sometimes not been my strong sense. So love to be here. I really love the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm a fan myself. I listen to it regularly and recommend it to a lot of people here in Australia. So I'm here in Australia. We're based in Queensland, which is on the Sunshine Coast, which is the exact opposite temperature to what you are there in Canada. I think you said you're minus 30 something degrees. Well, I'm positive 35 degrees today, which is about 94.
Yeah.
Which is about 94, I think, in the Fahrenheit scale. So it's a warm one today. And look, I grew up on a cattle station myself, as a farming operation. My dad was the third generation. I would have been the fourth. I spent 20-something years as a financial advisor, helping farmers grow, protect, and transition family wealth. My mum had really instilled in me from a young age, Elaine. She said, Ben, go out and get a financial education and don't be like us. And lo and behold, I listened to my mum, which I would never have told her I did when I was young. And it fell into financial advice. And I spent 20 years, as I said, doing that. And after a small stint in banking, which wasn't for me, and then a stint working for a hedge fund in London in the big end of money management town. In 2020, Elaine, I had a heart scare after 20 years of running a successful financial advice practice. I made the decision to retire essentially and change tact. I'd achieved all I could in financial advice and took a year off and tried to find who Ben was. He was no longer this financial advice bloke. And I started the podcast, The Financial Bloke, which was essentially about trying to take all those 20 years of experience I built in farming and being able to share it across the generations in the rural space. Because as a financial advisor, I could only help sort of 50 families, whereas as a podcaster, I could help far more. And that's evolved into AgriCoach. And about 3 years ago, I kicked off a coaching practice for families, helping them essentially grow, protect, and transition family wealth by attacking the problem of what we call succession, which I think you call farm transition in Canada, what we call the succession process, tackle that problem we have here in Australia head on. And I've been doing that ever since.
Well, and I think what's so wonderful about your story, Ben, is that you obviously understand the culture of agriculture because that's what you grew up in. And you did get a lot of good financial advising training, which you can still integrate into your coaching work. But I've entitled the podcast episode 40 that we're doing today, Cultivating Earlier Succession Planning. And that's what caught my attention with the work you're doing, is because I just had a membership call today and it became very clear to us. The theme was around our membership coaching happens every Tuesday. And one Tuesday of the month, it's just for content. But 3 Tuesdays of the month, we're as a group doing farm family coaching with my coaching team. And we're starting to see the financial literacy piece is so important, and that people have a hard time saying, I don't know what I don't know. And in transition, the message that's coming through to some of these people in our group is, well, we don't have the money to do that. We have a barrier of not having resources to even bring on advisors. So when today I'd like to focus on cultivating earlier succession planning. So imagine the Australians or the Americans or the Canadians or the people over in South Africa listening to this today. What have you found as a tipping point or a breakthrough piece for helping families? Because when I spoke to you last time when I was on your podcast, we were talking about a lot of your client families are younger than 60, so they're being very proactive. So what's the language that you use to help them get started or cultivate the earlier planning process?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd just like to go back just a tiny little bit, Elaine, and talk about the why. And
Okay.
so the analogy I usually give people is, well, actually, I'll go back a little bit earlier. Look,
Okay.
I've noticed through families over 25 years of doing this that there's some families become really prosperous. And I like to use that word prosperity, not
Yeah.
wealthy. Families have become prosperous and they manage to maintain that across multiple generations, which is really hard to do. You know, we've all heard of the 3 generation curse: two to make it,
Yes.
one to lose it, shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And so what I did was I observed the families that managed to do this really, really well. And I essentially in my head termed them as what I'd call high performing families. And I
Mhm.
looked at this and they'd said, well, why can two families be on exactly the same size farm, similar sort of situation? One thrives across his generation and the other one doesn't. And it all came back to, well, there's a few things they need to do to be able to do that that sets them apart. And the key factor that I've identified, and I've checked the research out and anecdotally myself from watching a lot of families, was that the families that succeed see the strength of the financial position of the family. So the financial strength in the family, the fact that we've got this financial knowledge and acumen and we're building financial strength. And I'm not talking about they have to be billionaires, but they're building a strong, solid financial base. They value that just as much as strong family relationships. And that's
Okay.
the key thing. And so if someone has a very strong balance sheet, a strong financial position, but poor family relationships, the wheels are going to fall off.
Yeah.
If they have really strong family relationships, but they don't have solid financial understanding and a solid financial footing, they're going to fail as well. So it's the combination of those two factors. Now, I'm oversimplifying this, Elaine, because there's a lot more factors in there, but that was the key trait. And so
That's kinda like the umbrella principle that you're working under.
yeah, it is, it is, and what I came to realize that within that, there was 3 factors that families need to look at, Elaine, is the first one is wealth. So they've got to grow, protect, and transition family wealth. That's important. There's a lot of money tied up in farms now, as we all know. That's a barrier to entry for new entrants, and it's also a difficult situation to deal with in succession or farm transition. We've got to so wealth And then wisdom. So we've got to look at the wisdom within the family. So that's the building the wisdom. We've got to transition the wisdom, and we've got to get smarter as we go. And the third one is wellness. Now, that's the one that catches a lot of people, Elaine, is that wellness part, because you'll see a lot of the farmers, like my dad, who's 75 on the farm, and as soon as you say the word wellness, they look at you like you're speaking another language. And what I mean by wellness is, the family needs to be aligned. We need to have strong communication skills. And we must have healthy minds and bodies. So that's the mindset component. And so if a family wants to succeed, they've got to be dealing with wellness, with wisdom, and with their wealth, and ignore any of those, and it's going to fail again and be a problem. And so, to just answer your question directly, and so what I figured out the analogy to give people is, well, this is all nice, but the problem is many people leave it to address these things until they're 70, 75, 80, and by then there's a lot of problems to deal with, and it becomes extremely hard. And so if I termed it like a polluted river, Elaine, if you find a polluted river over in Canada and you say, look, here's the pollution, we've found it on our family farm, would you be better to treat the water there or go back upstream and stop it at the source? And so for me, I said, well, I don't want to be in the space where I'm treating the symptoms and trying to fix it where the pollution is. I want to swim upstream. And I think that's the solution for a lot of families, is start early in this process and integrate it into what you're doing. The world's going to be a much easier place, so that ultimately you'll get to that transition and it'll be smooth and successful as it possibly could be.
Well, and I want to give a shout out to Anessa Good Hassard, who did a on Farm Credit Canada video presentation this past winter, and her company's Peak Heritage Consulting. But she was using the same approach, Ben, as you've just spoken, is to be proactive rather than reactive. And so I also am thrilled to tell you that my word for 2025 is number 2. It's wisdom. And I didn't know why I chose that word, but it just seems that more and more conversations keep coming back to that. John Ortberg wrote the book, The Life You've Always Wanted. And he said, I want to be rich towards God, and I want to be rich in relationship. And what good does it profit a man or a woman if you have all this wealth on your balance sheet, but you don't speak to anybody in your family and you're not rich in relationships, right? So you're talking about, number 1, the wealth, grow, protect, and transition. Number 2 is the wisdom by being able to share it to the next generation and increase your own learning. And then number 3, the alignment that needs to happen for wellness, mind, body, and spirit, as well as communication and being aligned between the spouses. So you had a tipping point health scare that sort of projected you into AgriCoach and your podcast. But you're still now also, beside podcasting, you're also consulting with a very select group of families. And you told me you just were at a family meeting yesterday.
Mm.
And I was at a family meeting yesterday. And what we mean by family meetings, mine was 2 hours long. Yours was 4 hours long, which is perfect because it primes the pump for what we see to speak and plant those seeds of cultivating top performing families. And I just also want to tell our listeners that if you go to the AgriCoach podcast, which is Ben Law's podcast, it's number 80 that you also want to listen to after this one, because he has a great interview with the Lord family, who I also enjoyed listening to, and it's called High Performing Families. So your goal now, Ben, is to be more upstream, be more proactive. So how do these high performing families, or these families that want to be proactive, describe to me and to our listeners, what kind of characteristics do these families have?
Yeah, it's really obvious when you meet them, Elaine. And what I want to be clear about is high performing families, as I call it, are built, not born. So they're not born that way. They don't wake up and they go, wow, we've got all the skills. They essentially build all their skills they need to do. But the first one, and I think the overriding one, Elaine, is what I call a growth mindset. So they're always continually learning, looking to do things in a new way. They're open to new ideas and experiences, and they're very flexible in their approach, and they know they need to be proactive, and they invest a fair heavy amount of time in the non-operational space. And what I mean by that is a lot of families, and I know that was with mine very much, all you talk about is what bull you're going to buy, what crop's coming in, what's wrong with the header, etc. So they spend a fair bit of time talking, but they also know that they've got to do three things, Elaine, when it comes to transitions is they don't necessarily articulate it this way, but in their gut, this resonates with them and they kind of know it. And the first one is they know they've got to prepare the business for the next generation to transition to. So they're always thinking 5 to 10 years ahead to be able to go, okay, if I'm setting this up for my kids or the next generation, what does that got to look like? Do we
You
need
have
to
a
scale up?
Yeah,
Yep. Yep.
and
They
I
have a real clear vision.
and I'm pretty sure you help them articulate that vision.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And sometimes that's the part of the building that high performing families is to extract that out of, in many cases, dad. Not always, it can be a mum's head, but getting it out and getting everyone aligned. So they've got to prepare the business. They've got to prepare the next generation. So they're very, very focused on saying, well, look, we've got to teach our son or our daughter to be a good operational farmer. They've got to know how to muster the cattle, how to brand the cattle, how to market the cattle. But they've also got to teach them the leadership, the entrepreneurial skills, the communication skills, the mindset skills to be able to have control over their emotions and be able to deal with people. And they've got to engage them into the business. So they know they've got to bring them along for the journey, not just say what I call a frog transition plan, which is you'll get it when I croak. And they also, so that's so they have to prepare the next generation, which is really important, but also too, they have to prepare themselves. So it's for ladies, and I'm going to be very generalized here, but for women, it's usually a lot easier for them because they think about, what's going to happen in the family, what's the next phase of what does my life look like? But for a lot of men, especially when they start to get up to 60 and 70, the thought of this dreaded R word, retirement or transition is terrifying for many of them. And I understand that because when I went through my heart scare and I retired from financial advice, sold my practice, I all of a sudden have to sit down and say, well, who the hell is Ben Law?
Well,
I no
you s
longer.
Yeah, and so we need to unpack that a little bit more, Ben, because that's your identity. But you're a husband, you're a father, you have many other identities than being a good financial bloke. And you had a year to let that percolate, which is quite a long time, actually. Most people aren't given that gift of time or make that space. So you have this Australian farmer who says, I'm dying here, man, with my boots. I'm going out boots first, and I'm not stepping back without stepping away, which is a great term that I've learned from my colleague here who's from America, Dick Whitman. And I love that term because it does address identity. So how did you get clarity on your new identity? And how do you help dad?
Yeah, well, for me, it was a lot of soul searching. It was very, very uncomfortable, which has allowed me to really understand, Elaine, how the men as we age, because I'm 47 now, so I've still got a lot of miles left on the tires. But
Hopefully.
yes, to understand that difficulty. But what we've got to do is try and dig in and understand with the older generation, because when you speak to most of the dads when they get older, it's usually I'm doing this for the next generation. I'm doing this for my family. And when you talk to them and there's friction in the family, I'll say, well, how's that working for you?
Mm.
Is what all this work panning out? And usually, if there's some family frustration or some conflict or those sorts of things, they deep down know. And so, what I try and get them to understand is you need to envisage your ideal future. Now, for some, that's I sell everything. I sit in a unit on the beach and drink lattes all day. Very few, but it's for some. And for others, it's like, well, I still want to be valuable. I want to be able to help out. I want to check the water troughs. I want to clean the silos out and just be helpful, but not be responsible. And my
Not be
comment to them are, yeah, and so my comment, Elaine, is well, choose your own ideal future. Don't let someone else make that for you. Because what's going to happen is if you don't plan out the future and articulate and have a vision for your future, it's not going to happen. And
So do
that's
you
when they end up on the farm alone.
So I'm married to Mr. Ambitious, Determined, and a man of very few words, Ben. So here was
Yes.
the transition plan.
Mm.
How much money do you want to make when you are stepping back? $120,000 a year. Where do you want to live? Wherever Elaine lives. Good answer. And third question, how much work do you want to do? I'll work when I want to and not when I don't want to. And basically in 3 sentences, that's my husband's transition plan.
Mm.
So my curiosity is when you're spending 4 hours with these clients of yours and doing family meetings, what's the language that you use to get it out of dad's head or mom's or the next gens and onto the table so that everybody can see what they're actually dealing with? What's the language that's powerful to you, Ben? Because you're very strong in data and you're strong in research and you're strong in financial savviness. So what are the because I think people listening to this podcast, what they've said to me is, Elaine, I really appreciate your approach. And I appreciate the fact that it has to be clear and concise and practical. So how do you help dad unpack what his ideal future is and what does he have to do to create that?
So I think the first thing, Elaine, is in a family meeting seldom works. So what I found over the years is it's got to be an ongoing discussion with dad when he feels safe. And
Okay.
I don't necessarily like to use that word because us blokes, we're not looking for safety. But if you put them in a meeting and you point the finger across the table and everyone's staring at them and says, "What do you want?" and they'll clam up and won't answer it. So there's got to be this process you got to go through with them. And it's almost like you're catching little bits of gold as they come out, and they'll tell you something and you've got to capture it. They'll tell you something else, you've got to capture it.
Nuggets.
3 months later, they might give you another nugget, and then you construct it, and then you've got to be able to read that back to them in their own language. So if I was a son, let's just say back on the farm with my dad, and I have these conversations, and I said, "So what do you want, Dad?" "Oh, I don't know." "Well, have a think about it." And then one day down the yards, he might pop up and he might say, "You know what? I just want to stay on the farm, but I really just want to have, I don't want to have to work every day of the week, and I want to be able to go to the bull sales up north." "Okay, fantastic. Let's catch that."
Yeah.
Because if you can capture those gold nuggets as they come up, document them on the page, and then read them back to them in their own language, that quite often is a way of uncovering what they truly want. Now, that doesn't dig into what the true needs are. Sometimes you've got to dig in, but there's a time and a place. And generally in family meetings, that's not the place. So for me, what I find where I get the most traction, Elaine, is to be able to have the family meetings, table these things, and then talk to dad or mum afterwards to be able, because they'll
Yeah.
usually then tell you the things that they weren't comfortable saying in the meeting.
And I totally, totally agree with that because I have this picture in my head. I'm in northern Alberta doing a family meeting with another one of my coaches, and I won't say who she is because, anyway, it doesn't matter. And we have the family meeting and we have a lovely lunch. And then he says, "Come on, Elaine, I want to put you in the truck. I want to show you around."
Mm.
And we're driving through the livestock and we're seeing where different pastures are and different things. And I also like the concept, Ben, of being shoulder to shoulder. Because there's something funky about the way men like to communicate is don't face them face to face. But if you're shoulder to shoulder, walking down the lane, walking the fence line, walking the crop, riding in the semi, riding in what you call the ute, like whatever you're doing, whoops, sorry, you have that ability to really find out what it is they want. So that's great.
'Cause they wanna tell you, Elaine. That's what I've found is they really wanna tell you, they just don't know how to articulate, and to be frank, they're usually they won't say it this way, but in my experience, they're scared to say things in those meetings sometimes because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, because they've said things in the past, and then quite often there's a pile on to be able to say, "Well, Dad, you haven't told me what you want," or "That's not clear, and I need you to give me clear instructions," and it becomes really frustrating for them, so they're scared, and look, I'll stick with that analogy about sitting beside someone. One of the
Mhm.
greatest breakthroughs I ever had with a dad who was in his 85, who was, sorry, in his 80s, he the family was totally fracturing, and the son who was 50 has said, "I'm out." There was no daughters, it was an only child. "I'm out, I'm leaving, I'm done, I'm finished." Mum and dad were just mystified, and I remember I leaned on the railing out on the porch, or the veranda as we call it, and I
Yeah.
said, "What's up, old fella? Like, you've done all this all your life to build this up for your family. It's all falling apart. What the bloody hell do you want?" And he just looked down while no one was around, and it just all came out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it fixed, and that was it. That was the fix, and it was just that one little conversation where he felt like he could have that clear conversation without feeling judged. that I managed to grab the little bits of nuggets of what he was after, articulate to that to the family, which then reduced tensions. And now they're in an amazing spot. Everyone's happy. And so I think there's some real importance to be able to give them the space to try and come up with it.
So space is one thing. Another one is patience and time, Ben. But patience wears out. And I was just speaking to a family this very day where they said, Elaine, we're not going to continue with this process anymore because we're getting an absolute brick wall on the other side. And I had that happen again before Christmas, and I'm happy to say that the breakthrough came when the elder generation realized that there were people who can facilitate and help navigate those conversations. So I think there's also there's the fear of loss of identity and not having meaningful work. And Ben, because you're a financial person and really good at that too, how do you address the fear of failure of the farm balance sheet going in the wrong direction, or the next generation literally taking it and screwing it up? Because we've heard the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeve stories. We're sick and tired of hearing these stories. We want to hear the high performing family stories because we want to be able to copy success and know what you've already outlined in terms of wealth transfer and growth and protection and wisdom and the wellness pieces that people pay attention to. So how do you address or speak against the fear?
Well, it's very difficult, Elaine, and there's two different places to be. Is one is in what I call the pre-succession space, which is where I'm in, which is that 5 to 15 years from transition. So usually 45 to 50, mum and dad are somewhere in that age bracket. And at that stage, it's about preparing the heirs, preparing the next generation. So if you're fearful of that, let's start preparing them. And let's start to teach them about the family history, the responsibility of custodial ownership, the fact that there's no rights here. It's a responsibility first, not rights, and start to prepare the next generation both on and off farm. So that usually then sets them up. And additionally is getting mum and dad into the mindset of, well, we've done all that we can to get those kids to when they're 30, say, or 40 to be able to transition to make that happen. And if they screw it up, well, that's the universe telling us that we haven't done our job and we've got to move on with that. Now, you can put some mechanisms in place, some legal mechanisms, et cetera, which we won't go into today to protect that, but it's much easier earlier on. Now, when you get to when people are at the older end of the spectrum, so they're getting to 70 and 80, normally it's around number one is a fear of them not being financially secure. Because if the farm's lost, they're destitute in their minds. So it's putting mechanisms in place to make sure they're financially secure first, is that deep-seated fear. Then there's ego. Well, I've built this farm. If it's lost, I've failed. So then we've got to address that. But ultimately, it's making sure we prepare the next generation to be good custodians of the wealth. And then if they're not, Elaine, call it. If
Yeah.
you don't think your children have the capacity to be able to take over, and I had a family about 8 years ago that had a $50 million cotton farm, a very large scale. And the son was a great young fella, a beautiful family. He was a good cotton grower. He couldn't manage the finances. He just couldn't do it. And mum and dad had protected him. And he got to 42 and mum and dad made the decision that he didn't have the skills to be able to take over the total family wealth. And so they sold the property, they downsized, they took some wealth for themselves, supported the non-farming siblings and set him up on a smaller property that he could thrive in. And so I think for some families, they've just got to make the call. Do our kids have the capacity to do this or do they not? And if they're not, make that decision. Now, that could be catastrophic for the family if they have that discussion, but if they address it appropriately, it can fix a lot of those problems.
So what are the telltale signs as you as a financial bloke looking at this family? What are the indicators that someone can grow cotton, but they can't market it or manage it?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So one is mindset. So they have to have a growth mindset. They have to be always learning. So you want the next generation. It doesn't necessarily have to mean they do formal education and go off to university and get a degree, but they must be looking at ways to improve their technical knowledge and their financial knowledge. Number two is you surround them with other advisors. Like you involve them with your accountant, you involve them with your bank manager from a young age. If you've got a financial advisor, so they start to learn those skills, and it's your job to help them start to get involved in doing the office work. So for that gentleman I mentioned earlier with the cotton farm, mum had totally sheltered him from anything financial. So he was 40 before he really understood anything about the
I
financial
know,
going.
and people will say, "Ben, Elaine, Ben, this is 2025. How can that still be happening?" And I'm here to tell you, listeners, there are still people who don't write checks or don't do e-transfers or don't have any financial transparency whatsoever. And again, I go back to my favorite Irish proverb, every front door looks beautiful. It's a beautiful cotton farm. Look at that great machinery you have. Look how many acres they're covering. Da 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 da. But what you don't know is that there's no financial literacy going on and there's no training. And I also want to do a shout out to the women listening to this. I've had women come up to me and say, Elaine, I don't really have a pension because I thought I had cleared it with my accountant, but I'm 60 years old now and I have almost nothing. And then I just lean into her and I say, how did you let that happen? Or I don't have my name on any property and I've been married for 45 years. And then I go, how did you let that happen? And people don't want to have, that's why we're coaches, because we don't know, we're not here to be liked either. Sometimes we have to ask really tough questions to shine the flashlight on. You protected your son, and your protection of him didn't give him what you called, what was very poignant about what you said earlier, Ben, is about the financial strength being a foundation. And if there's one nugget I think that listeners get from our conversation today is making sure that you're having growth, a growth mindset, but also building the financial knowledge and awareness and savvy of all the generations involved in your farm, even the 15-year-olds. I mean, we would have conversations at our table about what the price of barley was doing or how many bushels we sold or how it was yielding. And we told the kids about confidentiality and whatnot and keeping things, close in the family. And so to respect that, but there was never a culture at our table about not continuously learning about making wise choices.
It's incredibly important. I mean, the family meeting I had yesterday had 3 generations in the room, grandparents in their 80s, mum and dad in their late 40s, early 50s, and then kids in their teens and early 20s, and the youngest was 10. And we had a meeting, and the 10-year-old sat through the meeting. Now, she was distracted and wasn't really that interested, but she was starting to hear the vernacular. She was starting to hear little bits of conflict, not bad. She was starting to hear a strategic plan for the future. Though we were talking about values and what should happen within a family and how we should react confidentially. And then we also talked about their financial position. So we talked about the debt load they're carrying and the interest bills and all those sorts of things, obviously kept at an age appropriate. We're not going
Right.
to have catastrophic discussions, but I think that's really important because a lot of families on the land, mine was that, Elaine. My grandfather, we never talked about money. We never had any conflict in the family. We just buried it under the rug. Everyone smiled and nodded as if everything was okay. My uncle was an accountant. He handled the money. And so I had this total fear when I was a kid around money. And there's a story I can remember of my mum talking about money. So we were never taught. Whereas nowadays, I came to realize many, many years ago that I dragged the younger generation in when we're talking about debt and why. Like yesterday, we were talking about why have we got to buy another farm? They said we've got a big operation here. We're running close to 10,000 head of cattle. Why are we expanding? And then we did the maths up on the board to say, well, if there's 4 kids and mum and dad and the grandparents, we're going to cut this pie up. We need to keep growing it. And you could see all of a sudden the 20-year-olds going, oh, I kind of get that. Now, most families won't do that because they go, oh, look, we want our kids to go out and experience the world. We don't want to put any pressure on them. And, we want them to find themselves. And, there is an element of that. We want to do it, but we also have to start preparing them to be able to take over custodial ownership of this family wealth, whether it be a small farm like I grew up on, or whether it be a large scale. We're going to prepare them. And that's both the on farm and the off farm siblings. So those kids that aren't involved in the farm, we need to be involving them from an early age and talking about these issues. If you want to be back in the farm and you want to be involved, what have you got to do? Like what I call the when thens. If you want responsibility or you want ownership, this is what needs to happen. When this happens, then that will happen.
So when then, that's great. And I call those timelines and clarity of expectations, right? By when this happen.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a prime example. Oh, sorry, Elaine, go on.
No, I just wanted to address what you mentioned too about the non-farm kids who go off to get educated, and I had a blog response that was telling as well of a young woman. I have this blog that's been viewed many times about help my farm non-farm siblings want farmland. And of course, land is a huge issue, right, in terms of value and wealth cascading and all that good stuff. And she said, Elaine, what about talking about those of us who worked really hard but are off the farm? And the conversation always seems to be biased towards the farm child. And I, of course, don't have enough information because I haven't met this person, but I'm curious if the farm families that are growing and expanding have also asked the non-farming siblings, what do you want your relationship to be to this farm going forward? Because I have engineers and dentists and doctors and all kinds of professional people who still love and have an emotional attachment to the farm. And I had one of them one time say, Elaine, nobody ever asked me if I'd like to be a silent partner. And I'm thinking, you mean you want to invest in this farm? Well, yeah. So again, I think there's assumptions too, Ben, that are made that, this is going to go to this farming kid and this kid's going to go off to Adelaide or Melbourne or Brisbane or wherever. And we're downtown Winnipeg, and people are making assumptions. But I think it's also important that by this time we need to know what your decision is, because as you're preparing for the future, you can't always keep the barn door open for more people to come back.
Mm. Without a doubt. I think that's
And that
absolutely
is another really hard conversation. This ranch or this station or this farm can only support 2 or 3 families, not 4. So the horse is out of the barn, and you're gonna have to choose a different career.
Yeah, and I think the conversation's gotta be had because you'll either have the discussion now. Yeah, I love the old statement, "You'll either pay or you'll pay." You'll either pay now or pay more later. Quite often happens. So you've either gotta have the conversation now or it's gonna bring the family communication and relationships undone later on, because it's the unsaid things that are the problem. So they need to have the question. Now, if you're young, if your kids are young, and so they're teenagers or early 20s, you can start having that conversation about equal and fair. It doesn't have to be equal to be fair. If you do want to become a partner in this family business, you have to contribute. You have to take responsibility. You'll be liable for the debt. You'll need to be involved in some way, shape, or form. And I've got a lovely example of one family where two of the children are back on farm and one lives in the city. And he said, "Look, I wanna be involved. I'm in IT and computers." And
Yes.
3 years down later, we've integrated him into the business, and I would actually argue in many cases, he's one of the most valuable. He's doing the financial controlling, the administration, all the HR, so he's essentially running a lot of the office with
He's a
mum in this
digital
case.
nomad. He's a digital nomad
Yeah, yeah.
in the city that's still. I have a family like that too, and it's a beautiful thing. There's a social media account going on, there's HR, IT, like you said. And so the phrase I wanna cast to the listeners is, where is it written that you can't be of value to the farm even if you don't physically live there?
And my advice to them is, if you want to be involved, what value can you add?
According
So
to.
don't ask mum and dad. You need to work that out and you need
Yeah.
to pitch that to them because I hit this problem with the next generation a lot of the time is they say, I want, I want, I want. Not all, but they want. And I was like that when I was in my early 20s. 20-year-old Ben was probably fairly selfish and thinking about himself. But it's like, well, don't ask mum and dad for the solutions. And if you and this is a really important point for the younger generation, not when you're in your 30s and 40s and you've got mum and dad are in their 80s, that's a lot harder. But if you are younger and you're sitting there going, well, I can't have these conversations with mum and dad, skill up and come up with a plan yourself. Come up with a
Well, I
business
I
plan
totally
yourself.
I totally agree, and my coaching to that point, Ben, is what's your business plan? If you had access to these assets, you don't need to own all of them, but if you have access to these assets, what would you do? What would your enterprise look like? How would you make money? How would you manage and service your debt? So you said the 45 to 50-year-olds are your pre people that you're prepping. And then you mentioned your 70 to 80-year-olds who have some fears that you have to navigate. What happens to me? What happens to the 60 to 70, the 55 plus to 70 people? Like I think someone said we no longer have a sandwich generation. We're paninis. Well, I haven't had parents since 2011, but Wes and I, neither of us have any parents living, but we still have contemporary friends who have 97 and 98-year-old parents. And again, we can't predict the future, but we can plan for how we want to strategically navigate that. So, just as we wrap up, Ben, you've given us lots of things for cultivating early succession planning. I'll just rewind them again. The wealth part piece around growing and protecting and transitioning the wealth and being able to talk about money and have financial transparency. The wisdom piece around increasing our wisdom and also how we're going to share that wisdom to the next generation. And I have another book for you. It's called The Future Leader. It's written by my friend Patty Duran, who is a consultant with Bright Track Consulting, and she's written it kind of like in a story format between two people, and it's for successors. So if you're a successor to listening to this, check out that book because it's a great storytelling piece around how successors, like you said, also need to take responsibility for how they would do things and be leaders as well, and not just keep sitting around waiting for things to roll their way. And then I also really align with what you say about wellness. Because what does it matter if you worked your butt off on the farm for 20, 30, 40 years and then go through some real health issues? And this season of 2025 for my husband and I, we've already lost two friends our age or younger to cancer, and more are going through that journey. And you just, again, health scares wake people up, but I and you, I think, don't want that to be the precipitating factor. We want people to start taking action well before anything starts going sideways in terms of their wellness. So Ben, so great to meet you. I'm really looking forward to the day that you and your wife and your daughter come to play snowball fights with me in Canada.
That'd be fantastic. I know my little daughter loves the snow, the ones that we've been, and yeah, I think that'd be an
Yeah. Okay,
amazing
good.
thing.
And
And
if people want to find you, the best way is just to type in the Agri-Coach podcast, or what's the best way to find you?
yeah, absolutely. The Agricoach podcast. So we talk about all things about family succession, building wealth, growing and transitioning it. It's not a real financial bent, Elaine. There's a certain amount of financial, but we deal with this whole high performing space. And I do interview families, and I've got one tomorrow, and I've interviewed one last week, who are what I would say well on the road to becoming high performing families, so that people can listen to them and say, well, look, practically this is what they've done to be successful. And the other thing is agricoach.com.au is the website we use
Okay.
for the coaching business. And if I can just do one quick thing, Elaine, um, mums are usually, and I get myself in a bit of trouble here because it's not 100% of the time, but mums usually the ones to lead this process, because
Yes.
the ultimately what happens is mums look at this and go, look, our ultimate goal is we want to be able to sit down and have a family Christmas together.
Mhm.
And for so many families, and sadly, that's not the case. And so, usually, what I say to families is, mum's going to lead this. She'll get frustrated with dad. Sometimes it'll be the other way around, but mums are the ones that are usually the glue that holds the family together. So, for the mums out there that are trying to bring the family along, don't be despondent. Take your time, be patient, and just keep chipping away at it. Because if you're consistent and reliable and it's important enough, bring the family on in the journey and get some outside help. Sometimes it can just be one meeting, it could be 5 meetings, but just that one little thing can tweak or twist in the family and everything just falls into place. So be
And
patient and persistent.
I totally agree. And I'm thinking of an older mother today who was also on our membership call who talked about having a retreat where she went and got her bucket filled up with energy and to come back into the farming situation. And the other thing that I thought was beautiful that we'll leave this conversation on is she and her husband have developed a new practice of Sunday night at 8 o'clock being the flight plan time, where they sit down together as a couple to talk about the state of their union, their marriage, which is important for family relationships, but also what to expect in the coming week. So Thank you so much, Ben. It's great that you have lots of positivity and great examples on your podcast that my listeners can also now look forward to hearing. And again, again, yesterday in my family meeting, the mom said, I gave your podcast, Elaine, to my son, and he actually listened to it. And I go,
Mm,
that's a win. So there's no reason why using agricultural based podcasts and your favorite ones that you can't start sharing them within your family to help encourage them so that everybody starts to learn and have that growth mindset. So it's been a delight to have you. And maybe I'll get to Tasmania this year and hop across to see you up the coast. Thanks so much, Ben, for your time.
fantastic. Thanks for having me, Elaine.
Great. And listeners, remember that you can help us out by sharing this within your family and your peer network. And we're happy to offer you free discovery calls to find out more about our coaching process. And we look forward to seeing all those insights that you get on how you find harmony through understanding. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Take care and be well. Bye for now.